If you're an academic and you can get 1,000th of that, that's a major achievement. So I think in music, it's still mostly that part. There's a lot of work that's being done on algorithms, on new approaches to using AI for music generation, but most of it is really small scale and like quality over quantity, I guess. And the big breakthroughs are being done by big tech because they have access to the data and to the compute. Yeah.
Max, welcome to the Data Bytes Podcast. I have been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time because my background is in music before I switched to data science. And I'm a little bit jealous. You have a double degree in musicology and data science. So I love the fact that you combine these together at first. And you have been doing a ton of work in the generative AI space and music space, and post some really, really great articles on Medium and LinkedIn. And so I just appreciate everything that you're doing to contribute to this space because it's an exciting time. And I feel like I'm hoping that in 2024, 25, the music AI space will have its chat GPT moment as well. So
Yeah,
I hope we can get into that and talk to it a little bit more. But first of all, just thanks for coming on the show and contributing to the community in such a way that you do today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Very happy to be here.
So I'd love to just start off with what is the current state of AI generated music? Particularly, we've seen a lot of advancements in the past few years, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more here in 2024. But as someone who's been in this space for a while, how would you describe the current state?
Well, I guess the most surprising thing that happened last year is that we did get our first music generative models that could generate real audio, not symbolic music like sheet music or MIDI for the musicians, I guess. But it's really generating audio that sounds a little bit like music. That was already a breakthrough, and that was like the start of 2023. And I think we're getting, I guess, closer to the point where the music becomes of a similar quality to human-made music, but it's still a long way. So I really do think if you compare this to text, the music generative AI that we currently have is somewhere between GPT-1 and GPT-2, probably. So you can recognize it as text, but it's clearly not made by humans. And there's a long way until ChatGPT. But I do think we'll reach that point if we continue this trend.
And so how are these models currently built? Is this a similar process of human-based reinforcement learning? Can you talk us through a little bit about what's the base architecture of these models?
Yeah, sure. So most of these text to audio models, again, there's also the symbolic variants, but I'm mostly focused on the audio ones. These text to audio models are trained in a very, very, very similar way to image generation models, for example, where you really collect a gigantic data set of audios with labels, with text descriptions, which is one of the hardest parts of this entire process, collecting a huge data set of music with descriptions. It's not like with images where you find them on the web everywhere. Every image has a description. Not every track has a description. So you collect this gigantic data set, and essentially they're also using autoregressive transformers in the same way that you're doing it for text. Just like with images, there's also the diffusion models that are being used, where you generate image representations of the music, for example, and then turn it to a waveform again. So it's actually very, very comparable to text and image. And I think they're kind of, because it's a rather small field, it's usually easier and more effective to borrow architectures from more rapidly advancing fields rather than build music-specific ones, just because there's not so much resources.
So one of the things you mentioned was this labeled data set and how it's difficult to find. But I even wonder if we find a labeled data set or we create our own, how we may label it may be very different. And the reason why I ask that question is I loved music theory, where you would go through and you would find the chord progressions, the patterns, right? And you dissect a piece of music, which was beautiful. And I loved it because it was pretty standard of this is the interpretation of, yes, this is a C major 7 chord, right? And we could agree on that. However, if we sat and I listened to a piece of music and you listened to the same piece of music, we may both describe that in adjectives very differently, right? Let alone the language we use, the culture we come from may have different meanings to that music. So do you think that music will be a little bit different in the fact of we may have discrepancies in how we label things, and how do we get clarity of those labels?
Yeah, totally. I think it's most comparable probably to images, because there you also have these text to image models. And how are they trained? Well, you have images and they have descriptions. And typically these image descriptions are rather objective, right? So this is a cat sitting on a sofa or something. Like, it's mostly objective. Of course, there's also moods and impressions that maybe you find in the descriptions. But with music, it's totally different. So even if you give a piece of music a genre label, just rock or metal or a pop, that already has so many cultural implications and like so many facets, and it's so subjective. And usually it's not recognized enough, I think, how subjective something like genre even is. And we're not even getting to moods and situations that you would connect with the music. Nevertheless, we need these models that can connect language to music, or the other way around. So I guess this is kind of one of the key challenges in the field. And I do think we actually see this effect also in these music generation models, because yes, they're lacking scale, but even at the scale where these models are currently produced, they're very, I guess, insufficient at following the text descriptions. So if you tell the model that you need a piece of music in that style or with that instrumentation, or something like that with that mood, I feel like there's still, it's very tough for these models to follow the instructions appropriately. And I assume while that has to do something with the size of the models and the training data, it also has something to do with, how do you interpret a text to music request from a user? It's a much harder challenge than going from text to text, for example, or even from text to images sometimes.
Yes, definitely. Music is its own language, as many people say, right? It's universal language. And so we almost have I would say maybe a translation problem, right? Because we're translating from one language, which is this a spoken or whatever your local language is of English, and then to another language, which is music, right? And so is anybody working on that portion, particularly of the problem, or are people at this point in the landscape, we're really just looking, can we create any prompt and get close to what we're saying? Have we dissected the problems of music generation from prompting in any regard today?
Right. Yeah. So in academia, of course, people are working on this. It's actually quite the music information retrieval field. It's quite the niche field, but there's still lots of people working on this because it's fascinating, and people from all disciplines. And there is research on this. So, for example, how can you make the generation controllable by introducing, fixed parameters into the generation process, so that you can include the tempo, for example, or the key of the music as an objective fact in the prompt. So you have kind of the subjective parts and the objective parts separated, and you have some degree of controllability for the music. That, of course, doesn't solve the subjectivity issue. And I think, while that is a topic that people do care about in academia usually, and it's relevant, the big progress is currently being made by large tech organizations. And what they're essentially doing still up to this point is just collecting as much music as they can somehow find by any means necessary, and just, throwing them into autoregressive transformers. It's a bit simplified, but it's actually still how this is going. It's a little bit like with text 2 years ago or something. So where everybody's doing the same thing, scaling up, collecting more data, and seeing what comes out. We haven't reached that level of maturity yet, as we have with ChatGPT, for example.
Why do you think we're seeing so much progress from research being done by corporations versus research being done in academia? I mean, we saw the same thing with LLMs and particularly just the AI space in general. Why do you think that is? I mean, the whole point of research in academia is to lead that way. What's going on that happened, in your best guess or opinion, that is now causing organizations and companies to lead that charge?
Right. I think a lot of it is access to data. I mean, that's the same thing with text, right? So someone like Google, for example, has gigantic amounts of data, and they have, just, I think, Music LM, their primary text to music model from last year, was trained on, don't quote me, but I think roughly 700,000 hours of music. That's something like 10 million pieces of music. That's a crazy amount of music to have, especially if it's labeled. That's insane. And it's completely, if you're an academic and you can get 1,000th of that, that's a major achievement. So I think in music, it's still mostly that part. There's a lot of work that's being done on algorithms, on new approaches to using AI for music generation. But most of it is really small scale and like quality over quantity, I guess. And the big breakthroughs are being done by big tech because they have access to the data and to the compute. Yeah.
Yes, that is kind of the way of things today. If you have the computing power and the data, it's really just incredible of what you can do. And I'm curious if we're going to see this exponential curve of the progress we make scaling models up, right, with more data and more compute, if it's going to ever level out a little bit, right? And then that's when we want to look into new techniques and methods and ways of doing things. But so far right now, we're on an exponential trend where we're still seeing progress from it, which is quite exciting. I want to shift gears a little bit into your story and how you got into the space. You know, having two degrees, one a bachelor's of science in data science and one a BA in musicology. One, congratulations on getting 2 degrees, and then two,
Well,
what made you decide to combine these two fields together? How did your interests spur in both music and data science?
yeah, I mean, as one might guess, this double degree wasn't the plan initially, so it's unusual, yeah. But it's grown organically on me, I guess, because I signed up for musicology because I love music. I was and am a music theory nerd, and I really wanted to learn more about music theory. I wanted to learn about composition, and I really thought I was gonna do something like composition or maybe music education afterwards. I wasn't really sure about it, but that was my interest. And then in university, I actually discovered that the whole academic research with statistics and empirical research was really fascinating to me, which I never expected because I'd never been particularly interested in numbers before. I didn't hate them, but I also didn't love them. But that actually changed quite a bit. So I really was interested in academic research, statistics, and then my interest shifted more to machine learning because obviously that was the thing happening like 4 years ago or 5 years ago. And it was obvious for me that if I want to do something valuable with machine learning, it's most likely I can do that in the music field because when you read research about music AI, a lot of the time people are either coming from the computer science fields or domain, or they're coming from the music domain. And the computer scientists, they're lacking oftentimes the musical knowledge and also kind of the humanities academic training, whereas not everything is objective. Some things are there's some things about that are important for music. And on the other side, the musicians that have the music knowledge to do this research, they often are completely tech phobic and they don't want to learn anything about programming. So I felt like, hey, now that I have these two interests, might as well, do something in that field. That was kind of where that came from.
Yeah, I love the word tech phobic. I think a lot of people who
Yeah.
also work in business can relate to that, right? Is, you may be working with a marketer and they're tech phobic, but if you have previous experience in marketing and data science, you're that perfect bridge who can make that gap reasonable. I want to talk a little bit about you have two theses that you wrote. One is individuals' approaches to music streaming, the interactions of personality, uses of music, and technology acceptance. You have to love academic thesis. They are a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
They do not fit very well. They do not fit very well in our world of TikToks and Reels, right? A little bit too long. But tell me a little bit more, dissect this. What was this thesis about?
Yeah, sure. So that was really, I was interested at that time in the adoption of music streaming because of course, it was a widespread technology, but not everybody was actually using music streaming, especially if you go to the older generations, but even in the younger generations. And I was really thinking that, when people were doing research on the adoption of music streaming services, oftentimes a lot of this was just very business oriented and just like, why are people adopting the technology? Well, because they perceive it as useful. And there's this kind of technology acceptance framework that I also used in my study because it's obviously relevant if you think the technology is useful, for example, and so on. But I also tried incorporating music preferences into it because I do feel like music streaming caters also as a technology to a specific kind of listener. Because there's certain types of listeners. If you consume music when you sit down in your chair and you turn on your CD or your vinyl recording and you put on some classical music, you sit back, you do nothing else, then you don't really need music streaming services. On the other hand, if you're someone who tends to use music functionally for emotion modulation, for example, where you're on the bus and it's getting busy and maybe you're getting anxiety or you just feel uncomfortable and you put on the music and it helps you calm down, for example, or you use music to modulate your effect in everyday life overall. And I felt like this would be something that would cater to music streaming service listening. So that's actually what I kind of researched. Also, if personality makes a difference. And we really found out that personality itself does not actually kind of lead to a higher or lower adoption of music streaming services, but that actually this interaction of personality and music listening behavior makes a difference. And the music listening behavior itself kind of directly affects the adoption. So yeah, that was what that was about. That was fun.
Very nice. And then your second thesis was on audio-based classification of music preferences, dimensions using CNNs, convolutional neural networks. How did this idea come about, and what were some of the key findings from it?
Yeah, so that one is much more techy. So it sounds much more boring even than the other one because it's just, well, I use CNNs for music tagging. And honestly, that's kind of what I did. So it's like, so I've worked with the technology before using CNNs for audio classification, which is really cool because what many people don't know about music is that many music classifiers, most of them are actually not based on the raw music, the waveform, kind of the digitalized physical wave. But really, they're based on these image representations of music, which are called spectrograms. Musicians will know them. No one else will know what that is, but it's like an image of the music. And people did that because then they could just use CNNs, which other people had already discovered. So again, it's like very, very often in music. So I felt like I would like to dig deeper into this. And I tried to apply this also to a musicology concept. So I felt like in data science, when you read studies about genre classification, everybody was always just using whatever they could find. So there's these academic benchmark data sets that you find on the internet, and they have these 10 genres, rock, blues, country, this and that, and it's just taken as a given. Nobody ever thought about, are these the 10 genres we need? Are there more? Are there less? Do we need to weigh them potentially? So I actually did a music classification based on a musicological model about meta-genres, essentially. So how genres cluster together to 4 or 5 central, I guess, meta-genres. And I used a classifier to classify music into these 4 or 5, depending on which you use, meta-genres, which essentially was kind of the idea that if you have that, any music that is thrown into my system, my model can handle it because there's nothing missing. It's all of the music, essentially. Kind of. That was the idea, at least.
I love it. And getting back to kind of our previous point of how do we describe music, right? And what are those labels we assign to it? And are there more labels or less labels? And how we may describe that may be a bit different. When we talk about AI generated music, a lot of people have very different reactions to the idea of it, right? There are some on the maybe kind of the technophobe side of things where it's like, computers should never generate music. It's a very human experience, a human expression. I think some of that is going away a little bit just from what we've seen with images created, right? There was this idea that AI would never create beautiful images or do art, and we're starting to see AI in galleries. And again, this produces, I would say, a lot of emotions in humans in terms of, is that right? Is that not right? What are your personal feelings about AI created music? Do you think this is a positive thing, a negative thing? And how is it going to change the creation of music as a whole?
Oh, yeah, that's the hardest question, probably, because technology itself, as you know, it's never positive or negative. It's always the use cases with the technology. So any technology that's powerful could also be dangerous or extremely useful. And it's the same for generative music. Although I'm invested in the topic and I love to read about it and learn about it, I actually don't think generating audio waveforms is the most important thing that's happening in music AI. I think there's much more interesting things that are more artist-centered. We actually help musicians build stuff instead of just generating it from text to final version. But the general question, like, should we generate music with AI? In principle, obviously, there's no moral issue with doing it as an individual. But I do see some problems with the way it's being handled currently, because most of these AI generators that most companies are using are trained on copyright protected material, on intellectual property of musicians. And effectively, they are building generative models off of their music, which is IP protected, and they train a direct competitor to the musicians whose material they used. So that I think is a moral problem, and I think it needs to be solved through fair remuneration and contracts between artists and people training the AI models. And I think that's overall, is it wrong or is it right? Obviously, we have to accept the changes, how they're coming in some way or form. So there's going to be AI generated music, and it's more about shaping how it's going to happen. And I think if we include artists, if we're able to make them an offer also how they could participate in this new future, it's going to be much more attractive for them to join in on it and kind of adapt to it. Yeah. So I do see the negative side of this as well. The way it's currently being handled, I think it's not. Most of these models are not fair, but I'm optimistic this will change to some extent in the future.
Yes, I know this is something that gets brought up oftentimes in image generation as well. And I think,
Yeah.
at least in the US, we're starting to see a few lawsuits about it. Unfortunately, none of them have been won in favor of the artists so far from what I've been aware. But, I also question things too, because if I am learning a new instrument, I typically do not start by composing my own pieces and having my own expression, right? I typically start by imitating others and learning other great works. It's, in a similar process with music theory, you start to analyze and understand the components of how someone put a piece of music together. And we as humans are essentially taking in all those inputs into our own model, which is our brain, right? And making our own heuristics about how they may work. And then once we have a good understanding and different influences, we start to be able to generate our own, right? I see human brains working very similar to how our artificial brains work today. Yet at that same time, I do not pay any royalties to all my music influences, right? So I'm also curious of like, we as humans in some ways do that today. It's a common question when you hear an interview with an artist and they say, who were your influence? And they go, oh, I love Stevie Ray Vaughan. I love Lady Gaga. They start to say all these names, and then you can start to hear it in their music too, right? You can start to hear how those individuals influence. And so to me, it's quite fascinating from a standpoint of it's something we do as humans today and no one has a problem with. But when we do it in models, now we feel that maybe someone has been cheated or stolen. And so why do you think there may be a difference between what we allow models to train on versus humans to train on?
Right. That's a great question, because I actually have the same opinion in principle. And I've talked to musicians about it before. And typically when I'm speaking to musicians and they're voicing concerns about generative AI and that it's unfair that Gen AI learns from existing material and reproduces it, this is usually exactly my response. Aren't you doing the same? And I think we are. I truly think we are. Of course, there's some genetics and so on involved in how we produce music, but a lot of it is also just the influences that we gather. And we listen to music, we abstract patterns of how music should sound, and we use these tools that we learn, these abstract concepts, to construct new music. Same thing that optimally a deep learning model also learns. It's not memorizing if it's not overfitting. It should be, abstracting patterns that it can use as tools to generate new music. Ideally, that's what happens. So if the model works well, it doesn't just memorize, and it's pretty similar to us. I think the ethical difference. So I do think there's an emotional part of it. Just people react to it badly because it's an AI, and that's part of it. But I do think there's an ethical argument to be made because it's happening on a large scale. It's also comparable to data privacy, for example. when I'm walking through the streets, I'm also picking up names and I'm picking up locations. I'm picking up car plates, for example, and all these personal information that if Google would publish them or send them to me in an email about you, for example, they'd be in trouble, especially in Europe. But like and I think it's comparable to that because we as individuals, we also collect personal information and we do something with that. And we can also make use of these personal information. But as soon as if a big player does it on a large scale, it becomes a different magnitude because it has a different potential for danger for the individuals, essentially. That's kind of that. And the other argument that I made, these models are becoming not just disruptive, but truly dangerous competitors for entire sub professions of musicians. And doing that by training on their material without their approval, that seems problematic. So I guess those are the two ethical arguments I could make.
Yeah, I think those are really great points, especially on the large scale instance, because also what we're seeing from that large scale reproduction is that oftentimes they're taking that and reselling it, right? Even in the instance of ChatGPT, right? They took all of the blog posts and forms that were on the internet and now have packaged it up and you have to pay the $20 subscription if you want priority or fast, right? And so there is, I think, a sense of, yes, we do that as humans. I may read works of literature or look at pieces of art and be able to recreate that myself, but it's on a small scale, not taking what I've gathered and stolen from everyone and then repackaging it up and selling it. So I do think that the scale factor is a really good point in that regard. I'm curious where do you see things headed in this space? Are you someone who thinks that soon we'll be listening to completely AI generated music, and that will be almost a domain in and of itself, and that will be hyper personalized, right? I have Spotify recommendations, which are really good, and I can go in there and put in my mood and find a playlist. It gives me my discovery, but maybe in the future it's so hyper personalized where I give it a prompt and it creates that music on demand. Is that where we're headed, or is this going to be more of a tool that musicians use or individuals who have an idea for music can bring it to life through the assistance of AI? Where do you see the future of this field landing?
Yeah. Oh, so that's a great and far-reaching question, I guess. But it's something I do think a lot about. I tend to take the stance that not all music will be AI generated, and most of the music that people will be listening to will not be AI generated. I think, there's one argument is just, the sheer amount of music that's already available for everyone. There's hundreds of millions of tracks, or even just on Spotify or similar, there's like more than 50 million tracks. There's probably more music that you like to a high degree and that you can listen to. So there's much more music than you could even listen to, even if you wanted to. So it's more of a search and finding problem in some sense. So that's my first argument. There's millions of people around the world, hundreds of millions, who are willing to produce great music for free just because they love it. So that's a hard market to compete in for an AI generator, a commercial one. Everybody's doing it for free because they love it. That's a hard one. So that's the first point. I do think hyper-personalization is one of the niches where Gen AI really comes in. So for movie trailers, for example, really just upload your video and you'll get music that exactly has the right things happening at each point in time that's really representative of the video. So that's one use case, and I think that will be a serious use case. And it's also going to be in stock music because it's maybe even cheaper. So that's arguably. But I think when it comes to the everyday listening of people, you have to see that music is a deeply social thing, and listening to music is a social act in many, many, many cases. Me, of course, I'm also a musician, but when I listen to my favorite music, I can visually see the musicians playing their instruments, and it's a social thing. As soon as you hear a voice, someone singing, it becomes a social interaction between you and the singer. And that's something you cannot just disconnect from the music. And I do think generative music will become as good as human-made music in many cases. I think that will be the case, although it's shocking. I think it's happening in text and it will be happening in audio. But much the same way, I think that, who's reading, like people are still reading novels and not generating hyper-personalized novels with ChatGPT and reading them afterwards. That sounds crazy. And the same thing will be happening with music. You want to have something done by other humans that you can admire, that you can build an emotional connection to. And as long as there's such gigantic amounts of music that are being produced every day for free for you to listen to, I don't actually see generative AI taking over. In my life, certainly not. If you show me two pieces of music, and they might be of the same quality, but if I know that one of them is AI generated and one of them is human created, I will always prefer the human created one, because with that one I can build a social connection, and with the other one I can't. So that's my stance.
Yes, I like that stance a lot. The other analogy I like to think of too is, we've seen this a little bit actually in fashion. Well, fashion is not created from AI. Because of manufacturing and advancements in manufacturing, we've had this whole new category of fast fashion, right? With companies like Zara and H&M and Shein. But yet we still see the luxury, what we call now the luxury brands, where it's more handcrafted. It's gone up in price exorbitantly, right? And so I wonder if something around that regard is going to be true for music and for art, where when it's crafted by a human in human hands, the price of it will actually increase, because to create it artificially will be so readily available, so cheap, almost free, that to be a musician maybe and to have live music starts to become a luxury item as well, which, I can see some positives for it, in the fact of like, hopefully then artists can be paid more for live performances. But, does that also make it where individuals, it's not equally distributed, right? Where only a select few are able to afford it from, a 1% luxury item instance. So I don't know how it'll all turn out. I don't know if you've seen it's a Netflix anime show called Carol and Tuesday. It's probably my favorite anime show, but they explore this whole idea. It's all about two girls who are actually real musicians going up against AI generated music. So it's a very futuristic show. If anyone's interested in exploring this concept more, I would highly check it out. It was created in 2019, so this is one of the reasons why I love it so much. It's very forecasting of the world we're living in, or soon will be living in, here in the next few years.
Sure, and I completely agree. And I also think, when I look into the future, let's assume we're going to end up in this future where nobody needs to work anymore because AI is taking all of the jobs. That seemingly that horror scenario. But what are we going to be doing all day? We're probably going to be listening to music all day, right? So there's always going to be one person that's going to play, or a band that's going to play great music, and everybody, like hundreds or thousands of people, could just sit there all day, listen to the music, and be so happy about it. So I think, like, as soon as we have more automation, more machines, more things that are cheap, readily available, the relevance of musical interaction between humans can only rise. So I think music in of itself has a human-made music has a great future ahead. I'm sure.
Yes, I'm very much a tech optimist, and so I do hope that when AI takes over our boring jobs, that we as humans have the time to actually think and to create and to experience the creation of others. I mean, for me, that is why we are here and what we enjoy most as humans. We saw this through what AI was able to do in chess. I think a lot of people thought that once an AI beat individuals in chess or AlphaGo, like, humans would lose interest in the sport. But that's actually the opposite. In the US here, in middle school, chess right now in 2023, 2024 has been booming, which is just so exciting. And so I think that's also a good reminder that if AI can do something better than us as humans, we aren't going to lose our love for it. Like, and that I think is so important, because why we love it is the challenge and the process of what we learn, not necessarily the perfection, which I think is a beautiful part of being human.
Absolutely. And also, especially with music and arts in general, I would argue it's impossible for AI to generate better music than humans. I think there's a cap, because in art, humans decide what's best. So it's like if you're generating something that is of the same quality as what humans can generate objectively, that doesn't mean it's the most valuable to them, right? And humans will always evolve, and they will always evolve their preferences, and the cultures will evolve. And what great music means will always be kind of advancing with cultures shifting, and cultures obviously are driven by humans again. So I think we're never going to reach that point where we have to give up on music because AI is so much better at it. We're always going to be the best musicians, probably.
I like that. So for individuals who are really interested in this space and want to get into AI generated music, can you give advice first from somebody coming from a data science background? How do you learn more of the music side of things? And then secondly, the opposite, right? So someone coming from a music background, what advice do you have to learn the other half of the skills of data science?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I came from the music path, of course. So maybe I'll start with the more challenging one. So what do you do when you're a data scientist and you want to get started with music? I would say, if you're an experienced data scientist or you've been doing data stuff for a while, why don't you just, load an audio file into Python and just see what it looks like, and start reading about digital signal processing. This discipline is called music information retrieval. You can learn a lot about how you can feed this audio file into neural networks or traditional machine learning even. So I think the way from a data scientist to building music tools is actually not the hardest part. It's learning about the algorithms, learning about the tech, being interested in it. But of course, if you want to be heavily invested in the field of music AI, it makes sense to pick up instruments, to produce music and to analyze music. So I think, people voluntarily go into this field typically because they love music, right? They're not doing it for the big money, typically. So it's something that people love doing. So I would say, just start loading audio data into Python and reading about what you can do with the audio data and which algorithms people use in that field. So that's kind of where I would come from. And when it comes to musicians going into data science, I think that's kind of the more challenging part even. But what I would probably say is you're not going to get around doing some of the math and the data science fundamentals, because if you actually want to building these technologies or truly understanding them, you have to do the fundamentals. So there's amazing online courses on that, for example. There's amazing books on that. I think the critical part is at some point when you feel like you understand some of the theory, as a musician, just start reading some of the music AI papers. It's not going to take long until you realize, hey, this wasn't done well. There's this problem. There's this problem. Here's some musical knowledge that's missing. Here the authors did that wrong and that. So I think if you have that knowledge and you start reading the papers, you'll automatically realize what your place in the field could be. Yeah.
I think that's some great advice, two easy practical steps to come in from either angle. And I think there's, even if you don't even have either of those experiences, right? If this is a space that interests you, take up both sides of things, right? Either uploading the audio file or starting to learn an instrument. At the end of the day, do it because we need new perspectives in this space. And I think that's really how we're going to start to make that progress, as music is quite subjective and we all have our own experience in how we interpret and create music. So lots of room and opportunity for individuals in this space.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Well, Max, this has been fascinating. I've learned so much from this conversation and am so grateful for all the work that you do in this space. I'm excited to see how it evolves here in the next couple of years. Anything else that you want to leave our audience with before we wrap up today?
I couldn't think of anything actually. I hope this was fascinating, and I hope especially that some people who who are coming from either of the two backgrounds, so like from data science and interested in music, or from music interested maybe in AI, that this was maybe a cool conversation to get some inspiration for, and start on your music AI journey. Yeah.
Yes, and I'd highly encourage everybody, go follow Max on LinkedIn. He posts the papers. So if you're looking for where do I even start and what papers do I read, he posts a lot of great papers. And then also checked out his Medium articles and what he writes there. They're not AI generated, so they will be great. They'll be great to dive into it and read. So again, thank you, Max, for coming on the show. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much. It was very nice being here.
And a big thank you to our listeners. Remember to stay curious and keep learning, and we'll catch you next time on the Data Bytes podcast. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Data Bytes podcast. If you're looking for more resources to further your data career or find your tribe, we encourage you to become a member at womenindata.org. See you on the other side.